The United States owes 36 trillion. China owes 15 trillion. Japan owes 10 trillion. Germany owes 3 trillion. The UK owes 3 trillion. France owes 3.5 trillion. Every major nation on Earth is in debt. Total global debt is $317 trillion. $317 trillion. So that's 330% of global GDP. Every dollar of production on Earth doesn't equal the total debt. We need 3 years of global...
Pause right there. That line should make you uncomfortable. 3 full years of global labor, with zero eating, zero housing, zero life, just to pay the debt. So here's the real question. If everyone owes money, who exactly is collecting it? Because debt doesn't disappear, it transfers.
Someone owns $36 trillion in claims on the United States. If global debt is $317 trillion, someone owns $317 trillion in global assets. Who? The answer reveals the largest wealth concentration mechanism in human history, not through conquest, not through theft, through a system where the many borrow and the few lend, where interest compounds forever, and where debt mathematically cannot be repaid.
This is the key idea most people never hear. Debt isn't meant to be repaid, not at the system level. It's designed to roll forward forever. Think of this less like a loan and more like a subscription, one where the payments never end.
Individuals profit from perpetual debt, and why the system must eventually collapse, but only after maximum extraction. Understanding this isn't about economics. It's about seeing that the global debt system is the mechanism by which wealth concentrates in fewer hands, while making that concentration appear natural and inevitable. Before we identify who holds the debt, you need to understand what debt actually is in the modern system. Most people think debt works like personal borrowing. You borrow $10,000 from a bank. The bank had $10,000 and lent it to you. When you repay, the bank gets its $10,000 back plus interest. This is not how modern debt works. When a government borrows money by issuing bonds, the money doesn't exist before the borrowing. The act of borrowing creates the money. The central bank or commercial banks buy the government bonds by creating money from nothing through ledger entries. The US government needs $1 trillion. It issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve announces it will buy $500 billion of those bonds. Commercial banks buy the other $500 billion. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion? It doesn't have it. It creates the money by typing numbers into a computer. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet increases by $500 billion in assets and $500 billion in liabilities. The commercial banks do something similar through fractional reserve banking. The money didn't exist before, it exists now because of the bond purchase. When the US government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion is created through the borrowing process. But here's the critical part. Only the principal is created, the interest is not created. If the government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, it must repay $1 trillion plus.
Let me translate that into plain English. The system creates the loan, but not the interest. That means someone, somewhere, must always fall short, and the only way to survive is to borrow again. That's not poor budgeting. That's baked into the math.
Because interest is owed on debt but was never created. The system requires perpetual growth in debt just to service existing debt. This is not a bug. This is the design. Now let me show you who holds the debt. The answer is 4 categories of creditors: central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. First category, central banks. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in US government debt. The Bank of Japan holds $5 trillion in Japanese government debt. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion in European government debt. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion in Chinese government debt. Central banks, globally, hold approximately $25 trillion in government bonds. This is 8% of the $317 trillion total debt, but it's the foundation because central banks create money to buy government bonds, enabling governments to spend beyond tax revenue. But who owns the central banks? The Federal Reserve is not government-owned. It's a private institution owned by member banks. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks issue shares to member commercial banks. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo receive a 6% annual dividend on their Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in government bonds and receives interest, that interest ultimately flows.
This is where a lot of viewers get shocked. Central banks sound public, official, governmental. But structurally, many of them operate to benefit private banking interests. That doesn't mean conspiracy, it means incentives matter, and the incentives reward lending, not repayment.
Against war with France, Parliament authorized the creation of the Bank of England as a private company. The bank lent $1.2 million to the government and in exchange received the exclusive right to issue currency. From the beginning, central banks existed to profit private bankers by creating government debt. The ownership structures are more complex now, but the mechanism is identical. Central banks create money, lend it to governments through bond purchases, and receive interest paid by taxpayers. Second category, institutional investors. This includes pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds. These institutions hold approximately $120 trillion in global debt. Pension funds hold $50 trillion. Insurance companies hold $35 trillion. Mutual funds hold $25 trillion. Sovereign wealth funds hold $10 trillion. But who owns these institutions? Pension funds are theoretically owned by workers whose pensions they manage, but the workers don't control the institutions. The fund managers control them, and fund managers are paid based on assets under management. Insurance companies are owned by shareholders. MetLife, Prudential, AIG are publicly traded corporations, but share ownership is concentrated. The top 10% of households own 89% of stocks and bonds. The insurance companies are effectively owned by the wealthy. Mutual funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street manage $20 trillion in assets. Vanguard is theoretically owned by fund investors, but control rests with management. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded, with ownership concentrated among wealthy shareholders. The pattern across all institutional investors is that control rests with a small management class, and the ultimate economic benefit flows disproportionately to the wealthy. Third category, foreign governments. Foreign governments hold approximately $30 trillion in debt issued by other countries. China holds $3.2 trillion in foreign assets, including $850 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan holds $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. Why do foreign governments hold other nations' debt? Because of the trade system. When China exports $500 billion more to America than it imports, China receives $500 billion in dollars. China buys U.S. Treasury bonds with the dollars. The system benefits both sides in the short term. America gets cheap goods, and China finances the purchases by lending the money back, but it creates long-term dependency. Within China, who benefits from holding trillions in foreign bonds? Not the average Chinese worker. The Chinese government holds the bonds, controlled by the Communist Party elite. Fourth category, wealthy individuals and family offices. The top 1% globally hold approximately $40 trillion in financial assets, much of it in bonds. The top 0.1% hold $20 trillion. The top 0.01%, approximately 500,000 families globally, hold $10 trillion. These families, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, the Koch family, the Saudi royal family, hold massive bond portfolios. When you have $10 billion in wealth, you buy government bonds, corporate bonds, assets that pay interest safely. A family with $10 billion in bonds earning 4% receives $400 million annually in interest income. They don't work. They don't produce anything. They collect $400 million per year from interest paid by borrowers. This is the core mechanism of wealth concentration through debt. The wealthy lend to everyone else and collect interest.
Think about that for a second. Someone earns more in interest per year than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes, without producing a single good or service. Be honest, does that feel like a healthy system or a perfectly legal wealth pump?
Institutional investors hold $120 trillion. Foreign governments hold $30 trillion. Wealthy individuals hold $40 trillion. That's $215 trillion out of $317 trillion. The remaining $102 trillion is held by smaller institutional investors, corporate treasuries, middle-class savers with bond funds and their 401ks, and various other entities. But even this is disproportionately held by the wealthy because wealth is concentrated. The bottom 50% of humanity holds almost no financial assets. They hold debt. They owe mortgages, student loans, credit cards, car loans. They're the borrowers. The top 10% holds most of the financial assets. They're the lenders. So the answer to who is the lender is the wealthy, operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct holdings. The debt system is a mechanism to transfer wealth from the poor and middle class, who borrow, to the rich, who lend. Now let me show you how this mechanism has operated throughout history. Medieval Europe, 1200-1500 AD. The Catholic Church was the primary lender. Monarchs borrowed from the church to finance wars. By 1500, the Catholic Church owned 25% of all land in Europe, acquired largely through foreclosures on debts. The Medici family in Florence, 1400s, became the wealthiest family in Europe through lending. They lent to kings, popes, merchants. The interest income from lending exceeded the profit from any business. By 1450, the Medicis were so powerful they could install popes and influence kings. The Bank of England, created 1694, was the formalization of the debt wealth system. King William III needed $1.2 million to finance war. Parliament authorized the creation of a private bank that would lend the money to the government. The bank would receive interest paid by taxpayers, and it would have the exclusive right to issue currency. This was the blueprint. Create a private institution with government-granted monopoly on money creation. That institution lends to the government. Taxpayers pay interest to the private institution. The institution's shareholders become wealthy through perpetual interest income. The Rothschild family, 1800s, perfected the system. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons. He sent them to 5 European capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt. Each son established a bank. The family lent to every European government. After Waterloo in 1815, the Rothschilds held more government debt than any family in history. Nathan Rothschild in London famously said, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." By 1850, the Rothschild family held an estimated 50% of all government bonds in Europe. They collected interest from every major nation. The wealth they accumulated through lending exceeded the wealth of most nations. J.P. Morgan, early 1900s America, used the same model. Morgan lent to governments, railroads, industrial corporations. By 1912, Morgan controlled banks that held 25% of all financial assets in America. The pattern across 800 years is identical. Those who lend become wealthy. Those who borrow become dependent. The lenders accumulate wealth through interest income without producing anything. The borrowers work and produce, but owe ever-increasing amounts. And the system is designed to ensure the debt can never be fully repaid. The mathematical trap is simple. When money is created through debt, only the principal is created, not the interest. This means there's always more debt than money. If the total money supply is $100 trillion, but total debt is $120 trillion, including interest owed, it's mathematically impossible to repay all debt. The only way to service existing debt is to create new debt. You borrow new money to pay the interest on old debt. This makes the total debt larger, requiring even more new borrowing. The debt grows exponentially. This is why global debt has grown from $40 trillion in 1990 to $317 trillion in 2025, a 7.9x increase in 35 years. The debt doubles approximately every 10 years. And it must keep growing because if new debt stops being created, there's no money to pay interest on existing debt, and the system collapses. The people who designed the system understood this. The Bank of England's founders in 1694 knew that once the government borrowed $1.2 million, it could never fully repay because the interest owed would exceed the money supply. This is not a flaw, this is the feature. Perpetual debt means perpetual interest income. And perpetual interest income means perpetual wealth transfer from borrowers to lenders. Now let me show you who benefits from this system in the modern economy. In 2024, global interest payments on the $317 trillion in debt were approximately $15 trillion. That's $15 trillion flowing from borrowers to lenders in a single year. Governments pay interest through taxes. The US government pays $900 billion annually in interest on the $36 trillion national debt. That $900 billion comes from taxpayers. It goes to bondholders. Corporations pay interest through profit extraction. Corporations hold $90 trillion in debt globally. They pay approximately $5 trillion in interest annually. Where does that money come from? From the difference between what they pay workers and what they charge consumers. Households pay interest through wages. Households hold $60 trillion in debt globally. They pay approximately $3 trillion in interest annually. A family earning $70,000 per year, paying $15,000 in mortgage interest, $5,000 in other interest, sends 29% of their income to creditors. So the $15 trillion in annual interest payments flows from taxpayers, workers, and households upward to central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. The top 1% globally captures approximately 40% of the $15 trillion annual interest income. That's $6 trillion per year, flowing to 80 million people. The top 0.1% captures 20%, which is $3 trillion to 8 million people. The top 0.01%, 800,000 people, captures 10%, which is $1.5 trillion. 800,000 people receive $1.5 trillion annually in interest income from a debt system where 8 billion people are borrowers or taxpayers paying the interest. That's $1.875 million per person in the top 0.01% from interest income alone. This is the wealth concentration mechanism. Debt funnels wealth from billions to millions to thousands to hundreds of families at the very top. And the concentration accelerates because interest income compounds. If you receive $10 million in interest income, you use it to buy more bonds, which generate more interest, which you use to buy more bonds. Wealth compounds exponentially for creditors, while debtors stay trapped in perpetual repayment. The Rothschild family in 1850 held $2 billion in assets, inflation adjusted. Through 175 years of compound interest, that family's wealth is estimated at $500 billion to $1 trillion. They didn't build businesses. They lent money and collected interest for 7 generations. This pattern repeats across every wealthy family. The initial wealth was built through business, but the perpetual wealth is maintained through lending. They own bonds, they collect interest, they reinvest. The system guarantees their wealth grows forever as long as the debt system continues. And the system must continue because if it stops, everything collapses. Governments need debt to function. Corporations need debt to grow. Households need debt to buy homes, cars, education. The entire modern economy is built on debt, and debt requires creditors. The creditors are the wealthy, and the wealthy use the debt system to extract wealth from everyone else through interest payments that can never end because the debt can never be repaid. But the system has a mathematical endpoint. The debt cannot grow forever. Global debt is 330% of GDP. Debt is growing at 7% per year. GDP is growing at 3% per year. By 2035, global debt will exceed 400% of GDP if current trends continue. At 400%, the interest payments alone would consume.
This is the moment every debt system reaches eventually. When servicing the debt costs more than running society itself, the rules change, fast. And history shows the same thing every time. The people who understand the system early survive it. Everyone else pays for it.
All 3 outcomes destroy middle-class wealth while protecting the elite because the elite hold hard assets, multiple currencies, and geographically diversified holdings. The middle class holds debt, local currency, and undiversified assets. This is by design. The system was designed to concentrate wealth during both expansion and collapse. During expansion, the wealthy collect interest on perpetual debt. During collapse, the wealthy buy assets at fire sale prices from bankrupt borrowers. This happened in the Great Depression. When banks foreclosed on farms, wealthy investors bought the farms. Small farmers became tenant farmers. This happened in 2008. When homeowners defaulted, BlackRock, Invitation Homes, private equity firms bought hundreds of thousands of homes at 50% discounts. Home ownership decreased. Corporate ownership increased. This will happen in the next crisis. When the debt system breaks, the middle class holding debt will default. The wealthy holding assets will buy the defaulted assets at discounts. The $317 trillion debt system is not a crisis. It's a wealth extraction mechanism designed to transfer wealth from the many to the few during both good times and bad. And you cannot escape it because the system is global and totalizing. You pay interest on your mortgage to a bank owned by shareholders who are disproportionately wealthy. You pay taxes that service government debt owned by bondholders who are disproportionately wealthy. Every economic transaction includes an interest component that flows upward. The average American pays $20,000 annually in direct and indirect interest. Over a lifetime, that's $1.4 million in interest payments flowing from you to creditors who are, on average, 100 times wealthier than you. This is the system. Create money through debt, charge interest, collect perpetually, concentrate wealth in the hands of creditors, ensure the debt can never be repaid so the interest never stops. The $317 trillion question has an answer. The lender is a small global elite operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct holdings they manage. They are creditors to everyone else. And the interest payments from 8 billion people to the top few million is the largest wealth transfer in human history, happening every single day, invisibly embedded in every transaction. But even the collapse will benefit the creditor class because they'll convert their paper claims into hard assets during the crisis. The system extracts wealth during expansion and during collapse. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Now you know. The people who designed the system to ensure they would always be creditors, while everyone else would always be debtors. And that system, operating through $317 trillion in debt, extracting $15 trillion annually in interest, is the mechanism by which the modern global economy transfers wealth from the bottom to the top, perpetually and inevitably. If this showed you who actually holds the $317 trillion in global debt and why the debt system is a designed wealth extraction mechanism, subscribe, because the next video will show you the endgame. What happens when $317 trillion becomes $500 trillion of interest payments exceed global GDP? The 3 possible outcomes: default, inflation, or jubilee. Which outcome the elite are positioning for? And why all 3 outcomes transfer wealth from the middle class to the top? The $317 trillion question has an answer. The $500 trillion question is what comes next. And the answer determines whether you preserve wealth or lose everything.